Fantastic. Well, thank you. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm not going to stand at the lectern if that's okay. So I'm honored to be back at the Union. I had to actually do the maths. It was 27 years ago that I came to Oxford to read philosophy and psychology, and I saw many great speakers here, including the Dalai Lama. That's the one that sort of stuck with me. So when I called my husband earlier today, he said, you know, this might be the most important audience you're going to address because they still can make a difference to the future. So no pressure at all. I hope I can inspire you. So now I live in California and I work at X, which is Alphabet's moonshot factory. And that is actually my real job title. Conference organizers sometimes think it's a joke, but no, it's on my business card. So when I thought about this talk, I thought I'll cover 3 different areas. So first of all, you're probably curious about the moonshot factory. So I will give you a glimpse into what it's like to work there and the projects that we work on and some of the things that we've learned, particularly around failure and how to deal better with failure. Because I really think that we can learn as individuals, as organizations, and as society to deal with failure more productively. And I think it's a really integral part of the innovation process. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some of the technologies that attract both hope and trepidation in equal measures, including robotics and artificial intelligence. And I'm going to argue that they're tools rather than ends in themselves, and that we need to really think about the problems that they can solve rather than the technology itself. And then third, which is related to that, as you'll see, I'm going to argue that we actually need the most diverse and brightest minds to work on this, to take technology and apply it to the problems that we face today so that we can invent the future that we want to live in. And that's where basically all of you come in, not just the engineers and the computer scientists amongst you. Okay? All right, so let's start. Where am I pointing this? There. There? Okay. I might just say next slide and you can advance it. Okay? Right, so here's the kind of projects that we work on. Self-driving cars, the project that actually founded our group. It's now graduated from X in a company called Waymo. Next. Delivery drones, now also a company called Wing. Next. Glass, a project that I'll talk about a little bit later, smart glasses. Next. A smart contact lens, that's now part of a company called Verily. Next. Internet from balloons, now called Loon. This is actually the project that brought me to X, so I'll definitely talk a bit about it. Next. Project Malta is an energy storage company to store surplus solar and wind energy in molten salt. And carbon neutral fuel from seawater, which is one of our great failures that I'll talk to you about. Now, the New York Times also, if you go to the next slide, reported that we're working in a space elevator. We're not, at least for the time being. We think that this breaks the laws of physics, but I'm routinely told by somebody that it doesn't. So who knows, you know, maybe one day. Okay, so you might ask yourself, oops, now it seems to be working, great. So you might ask yourself, these are very disparate projects, what ties them together? And this is what ties them together. So our mission is to invent and launch moonshot technologies that make the world a radically better place. So we want to solve very large problems in the world with the help of technology, and we also want to build big new businesses for Alphabet in the meantime. So what's a moonshot? This is our definition. It's technology driven because we're a tech company. So we start with a huge problem in the world, something that would affect hundreds of millions or even billions of people if it was solved. Then we propose a radical solution, something that sounds like science fiction today. And then we pick things where we think that within the next 5 or 10 years, like real advancements in technology and science can turn it from science fiction into reality. So that sounds really easy, right? But of course, in reality, it's not quite so easy, and that's where the failure part comes in. So I really think that this is what's important. Like, it's about accepting that we're going to fail and then failing gracefully on the path to success. And This is one of my favorite quotes. Thomas Edison probably never said it, but it's a great quote anyway, that I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. So the path to success is definitely littered with failure. And I grew up in Berlin in Germany, and in Germany, failure is not something to be proud of. It's very countercultural, and we would look enviously across the Silicon Valley, where it seemed that even the failures were celebrated as heroes. Well, I've lived there for 6 years now, and I can tell you that's one of the great myths of Silicon Valley, because nobody celebrates the failures there either. Everyone always talks about their success. You know, people talk about their startup going fantastically well. Investors always tell you that their latest deal was like the next big Google or Facebook or Lyft or Slack or whatever, right? But I think what is different is that people are better at facing the face of fear of failure. So they try in the first place, and they're also better at picking themselves up if they do fail and trying again. So I think that's like something that can be learned. And I really think that fear of failure is one of the biggest impediments to innovation. It's not money. Like, you know, I've had a lot of discussion with people where they say, you have so much money, Alphabet can afford to do this. That's not what it's about. It's really much more of a cultural thing. And these are very real fears, because we're afraid of losing face, we're afraid of losing our pride, our bonus, our job, maybe our company if we're an entrepreneur. And to counteract those fears is tough, you know, it's really hard. And as Stephen mentioned, I lead early stage projects at X, so most of the things that I've worked on in the past few years have failed. And so I constantly think about these questions like, which projects do we start? Which ones do we end? When do we have to call it quits? And above all, how can we make it safe for our team to operate in this kind of inherently unstable environment? How can we create psychological safety for the team? So I don't have all the answers, but I wanted to share some of the things that we've learned. So the first one is nothing, apparently. So the first one is, to go back to that Edison quote while he gets it up, to be audacious, you have to be humble, and you have to accept that most of what you're going to try is probably not going to work, and that's okay. So we're not aiming for perfection on the first go at X. We just accept that we're going to learn as we try things again and again. And so one thing that might help you is actually reframing it. So instead of saying, I'm aiming to fail fast, which just doesn't make any sense, what about if you say, I want to learn as fast as possible? So that means running at the hardest problem first. And we have this image, which is, wow, not this one. It doesn't matter, I can do this without slides. So it means running at the hardest problems first. And so imagine you want to teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare sonnets while standing on a pedestal. What do you do first? Do you spend your time teaching the monkey, or do you build the pedestal? Now, human nature is that you really want to build the pedestal because you know how to do that. So we make a to-do list and we immediately go, okay, which are the things that I know how to do? I'm going to work on those first, right? And what I'm arguing is that that could be a ginormous waste of time, because if you find out after you've built this beautiful pedestal that it's actually impossible to train the monkey, you've wasted all that time doing the easy things first. So when we start a new project, I ask my teams to make a list of all the things that could kill the project, and I ask them to rank them by how severe is this risk, so could it kill the entire project, and how confident are you that we can solve this problem? And then we force ourselves to work on the ones that are hard on both of those dimensions, and that's very counterintuitive. So let me give you an example from X. Project Loon. As I said, it was the project that got me to X in the first place a few years ago. What we're trying to do here is to connect the whole world to the internet using a network of balloons that float 20 kilometers up on the edge of space in the stratosphere. And that is going to enable us to connect people, especially in remote and rural and poor areas. Now, that sounded completely crazy when we first proposed it, and there's a reason the project is called Loon, and the team actually proudly calls themselves the Loonies. And to make it work, they had to solve many technical challenges. So, for example, the data transmission between the balloons, the data transmission between somebody's mobile phone on the ground and the balloon. And so they built early prototypes. They took a styrofoam box, they put some consumer electronics inside it, some radios, they strapped it to a weather balloon and they sent it up into the stratosphere. And actually it worked. They got some connectivity, very slow, but it was there. But another technical challenge was making the balloon itself. You know, when you have helium balloons for a birthday party and the next day they all come down, that's basically what happened with our balloons. I wrote the first business model for Loon, and it said the balloons had to stay up for 100 days, and our first days, the balloons lasted 5 days. So we were definitely a very long way away from perfection. And it turns out we had leaks, tiny little holes in the balloon, and the helium would seep out. And the leaks were the monkey, and nothing else mattered until we had addressed the leaks. So we set up a special testing team led by a lady called Pam. Her job title is head balloonatic. And she and her team studied other products where leaks really mattered, like chips, packets, and sausage casings, and even condoms. And they ran helium detectors on the outside of the balloon, etc. And they tried all these different things, most of which yielded nothing. But then they ran one experiment in our balloon factory. And they did a line dance in normal socks on the balloon material because they realized that people were walking around in the balloon material during the manufacturing process. And then they gave everyone very soft, fluffy socks. And they found that the fluffy socks didn't damage the balloon material as much. So they banned all normal socks from the factory. That's a joke, of course. But they did, in all seriousness, realize that we had to make some changes to the manufacturing processes. So now they take care of the material so it doesn't get damaged actually before it even hits the stratosphere. Back in the lab, Pam and the team built a huge giant light table. It's called Billie Jean, because Michael Jackson. And in that lab, you're only allowed to wear shark slippers, so no shoes. But they also changed the way that the balloons were launched. So in the beginning, we did it manually. Will you just, oh, here we go. I can now flick you quickly through these slides. So that's the monkey in the pedestal. That's an illustration of balloons flying 20 kilometers up. That's a picture of our first prototype, which is now proudly displayed just behind our reception. And the reason I wanted to show you that picture is because it shows that all of our projects have very humble beginnings. So this is the thing that they're strapped to a weather balloon and sent up. That's Pam in the balloon lab. And that's the line dance, a very fuzzy photo that someone took on their cell phone. And that's her lab with the shark slippers. So much nicer with pictures, right? And this is how we now launch balloons. And so you can get a sense of the scale of the balloons. They're much bigger these days. They carry much more equipment. And they're launched completely automatically, whereas in the early days, you know, we'd be dragging the balloon material along the floor. So in 2013, Loon did its first real test in New Zealand. So these pictures are from the South Island in New Zealand. And the first person to be connected was a guy called Charles, who was a sheep farmer. The first thing he did was check the weather, very important for sheep farmers, and his Facebook, which is kind of funny, surrounded by Google engineers. He only got a few minutes of a very slow connection because it was essentially we were using Wi-Fi spectrum. And then we partnered with phone companies so that we can actually connect directly into their LTE spectrum. So now you can get internet from balloons at LTE speeds. Now, we've flown more than 30 million kilometers of test flights, and the longest time a balloon has been up in the stratosphere has been 198 days. So definitely tackled the monkey there. So then it was time for Loon to be exposed to the real world, and that's what happened when Hurricane Maria destroyed Puerto Rico last year. And the entire infrastructure was knocked out, including the electricity grid, but also the phone infrastructure. And we actually have a launch site in Puerto Rico. So we had people who were living and working on the ground, and we immediately said, what can we do to help restore connectivity on the island? So we worked with AT&T and T-Mobile to, within a few weeks, restore connectivities. And we've been serving about 250,000 people with LTE speed internet from balloon over Puerto Rico. that was really insightful for the team. They learned a ton by suddenly like serving terabytes of data and being in a very like real world environment under like pretty high pressure, serving real customers. So now I want you to turn to your neighbor and think about a project that you worked on where you think you worked on the pedestal rather than the monkey. I'll give you 1 minute. I hate to cut you off, but we're going to do more of these, I promise. So, one of the questions I always get is, so you're pivoting and you're trying new things and you're working on your monkey. When do you know when it's actually time to call it quits, right? And this is one of the hardest things for an entrepreneur to know. So for us, one of the tricks that we found is to not just set success criteria at the beginning of a project, but to also set kill criteria. Because it's very easy to envisage what the world looks like when you're successful, right? You paint this beautiful picture to yourself, and you need that, because otherwise you would never get going in the first place. But it's incredibly useful to, at the same time, also set kill criteria. Like, when would I shut this project down? So I asked my team to make that list with all the reasons why a project might fail. And then I asked them to come up with very specific metrics that say, okay, so if we don't make this round-trip efficiency on Project Malta, on our energy storage project, like when do we think it's no longer good enough and we would have to shut this down? And when these kill criteria hit, it makes it a much less emotional decision to shut the project down, because you're not arguing about whether to shut the project down, which is highly emotional. You're arguing about whether your criteria is fulfilled or not, right? So let me tell you the story of one of my favorite projects. It was called Foghorn. So Foghorn's goal was to make carbon neutral fuel. So we took carbon dioxide from seawater, and we used clean electricity to make hydrogen, and then we combined the two to make a synthetic fuel. And you could burn it in any vehicle, planes, cars, trucks, whatever. And when it burns, the CO2 gets released back into the atmosphere. But because you've removed it from the sea in the first place, you're not adding any new CO2. So it's kind of like carbon recycling. It's an amazing idea, especially because there's over 1 billion cars in the world that are not going to all be electric overnight. So the team figured out how to solve many of the technical challenges. This is actually a picture of our lab. It's at Xerox PARC, one of the great old labs in Silicon Valley that's still going. And you can see the bucket that says ocean, that's the seawater going in. And then on the right, you can see Kathy Cooper, who was the project lead, and she's got a little vial of sea fuel that we got out of that machine. But we also set a goal that we wanted to make the fuel at the same price as conventional fuel, so it would be widely adopted, because we didn't believe people would be willing to pay materially more for it. So you can probably guess what this is. What do you think?
Oil price.
Oil price, exactly. So when we started the project, the oil price was around $100, and then it went to 50, and then it went to 30, and when it hit 30, the team came to me and said, that's it, like, we can't make this work anymore. They'd basically said their own project was no longer feasible, and they hit their kill criterion. So for that decision to shut down their own project, I gave them a bonus. HR thought it was crazy that I gave them a bonus for failing, and I said, no, I'm not giving them a bonus for failing, I'm giving a bonus because they've come to this conclusion themselves, and besides, they gave me project money back, so it was a good deal for me. The bonus was smaller than the project money I got back. They then shared their post-mortem analysis, honestly, with all of their colleagues at X, but they also wrote 2 papers that were published in peer-reviewed journals. So you can now look at our cost model, and you can look at our method in those papers. And there's a Harvard Business School case study now about it. So I like to think that this project is maybe not dead, just deep frozen, and maybe somebody will discover something that we have overlooked, or maybe one day there will be pricing in fuel that actually adequately reflects the cost of the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. So very quick, 30 seconds, think about something you're working on. What would be your kill criterion for it? And tell your neighbor. Good to have you back. I think we're all going to have to go to the bar afterwards and continue these. Okay, brilliant. So now this story does have an interesting ending, because after Foghorn closed down, Kathy actually started another project, which was making geothermal heating and cooling for the home. And she took that out of X as its own company. So she's now the CEO of a startup called Dandelion, and is serving their first customers in upstate New York. So that's, I think it's a super cool story, and I'm really proud of her. So I've mentioned a little bit already about like how do you take the lessons, right? So we actually learned that it's incredibly important to celebrate the lessons from failure. And then this is one of the ways that you can counteract the fears. So how can we make it possible for our teams that they're honest with themselves and that they actually also talk about it, right? So we do some things very actively as a company to reduce that fear of failure. For instance, you can still get promoted if your project fails, if you've done really great work on that project. We have all hands, where the entire all hands is just about all the things that go wrong, and people share what they've learned from those things. They are often the most interesting and funniest all hands: exploding balloons, crashing drones, all that. When a project does shut down, we help people find another role, often within X. And we encourage them to start new projects, like Kathy. So these things are all kind of very rational methods of dealing with failure. And it kind of surprises me that companies don't do this more often. So when I do this talk with company execs, they all like take notes and go like, must change promotion process. But we also have to acknowledge that there is always an emotional side of failure, right? So humor can help. We have a team called Rapid Evaluation, which is the team that works on the very early stage ideas. Now, if you think of X as like a big funnel where we put lots of things on the top, at the top, and then eventually maybe one self-driving car company comes out at the end, most stuff dies on the way, right? And these guys work on the top end of the funnel. So their investigations die so much that all they get is a little sticker with a crumpled piece of paper on it. But they actually put them on their laptops and they display them very proudly, and the more crumpled paper stickers you have, the cooler you are as a rapid developer. But there's undeniably also a dark side. So I did psychology, and this is a model developed by a psychologist called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 60s, and it's the stages of grief that we go through when a loved one dies. And I don't want to compare like business failures with like what happens when someone you love dies, but it struck me that the stages are actually very similar. Like when I see our teams go through this, or when I see entrepreneurs whose startup has shut down, they do go through grief. So the first few stages are things like shock and anger and denial. And you can address some of those with those things that I described, right? If you set your own kill criteria and you make the decision yourself, you're not going to bargain as much, and you're not going to be angry with your boss the same way as if your boss sort of says, well, you know, we've run out of budget, so your project's the one that's going to get killed. But after that, there's always still a depression period, and to let ourselves grieve during that depression period is really important in order to get through to acceptance. But I did want to end this section on a lighter note, so I'm going to leave you with this picture for that. So when we learn to walk, falling is completely part of the process, right? Toddlers just fall over, they pick themselves up again, and they try again. So what happens in that process between that toddler and probably where you guys are sitting now, that is no longer okay, and that when we fall over as adults, like we become paralyzed? And I think that's a social thing. It's like our society has sort of ingrained it in us. So we basically have to go and unlearn some of it and go back to toddlerdom, but hopefully without the tantrums. Now that we know how to fail gracefully, let me talk a little bit about how we're going to succeed, okay? So I'm a product person, not an engineer. So one of my guiding principles is that we actually have to fall in love with the problem, not with the technology. The technology is just a tool. And we often work at X on projects that sound like science fiction, right? Like cars that can drive themselves, and drones, and internet balloons, and so on. Now, what's interesting is that many of those projects actually have their roots in academia. For instance, this one. In the early 2000s, there was two fiercely competing robotics teams, one at Stanford and one at Carnegie Mellon, and they were competing in challenges set by DARPA. And they actually won one challenge each. One won the desert one and the other one won the urban one. And then the two teams came together. It was then Google and then became Google X. That was like the seed project for our group. Now, this is what a Waymo car sees as it's driving through Phoenix. So this car is essentially a robot. It's enabled by a whole range of technologies that have made huge advances in the last 10 years. So for instance, computer vision, like perception, the image processing, the mapping, the sheer compute power to be able to deal with all that incoming data. And then we apply machine learning and fuse all those different sensor data together in order to tell the car what to do. So that means it's now possible for a car to drive better than a human can. But initially, it couldn't. So this was our first prototype. This car could only drive autonomously on the motorway. And the driver had to be ready to take over if the car couldn't deal with a particular situation. So what we did is we gave it to 10 people to use it on their daily commute to and from Mountain View. And we found that this kind of theory that the human could take over was deeply flawed, because as soon as the car was in autonomous mode, nobody paid any attention. People were on their email, they turned their back on the car going 60 miles down the highway, they daydreamed, you know. So when we realized that humans were in fact not a reliable backup for the machine, we stopped that experiment and we pivoted. We pivoted from semi-autonomous to fully autonomous vehicles, which is actually much, much harder. There's a big step between what's called level 3 autonomy and level 4 and 5. So we had to basically reset, and we built this. This is called the Firefly, and it's a car that doesn't have a steering wheel and it doesn't have any pedals. It still has wing mirrors because that's written into the regulation. So when we showed it to the regulator, they were like, "Where's the steering wheel?" And we're like, "Not in the regulations." And this is actually a drive. This guy in the car is called Steve Marin, and he's blind. So he, in 2015 in Austin, Texas, which is a suburb in Austin, took the first truly autonomous car drive. And fast forward to today, Waymo is now its own company and partnered with Fiat Chrysler to make the first kind of proper self-driving car, because that other one was very much a prototype. And funnily enough, they're kind of mummy vans, because when we did our user research, we found that families with a lot of kids, especially teenagers, were the ones who wanted self-driving cars the most, because they spent all their time ferrying their kids around. So these projects, many of them have these roots in academia, and that's because universities and research institutions are really great at coming up with new science and new breakthrough technologies. But once the paper is published, that's sort of often it, right? So there's all these amazing insights that are sort of languishing in academia. And so this is the role that we can often play, is we can pick something up when people don't believe yet it's possible and take it up, make a better prototype until we can convince often the industry that we operate in to then partner with us to take it to market. So when we started with self-driving cars, the car industry were like, oh, this is 50 years away. And now most car companies do have some sort of autonomous car program. Sometimes the academics come along for the ride. So this was the contact lens that was made at the University of Washington that can detect glucose in your tear fluid. And those two professors who worked on that actually came to X and made a much better prototype that convinced Novartis to have a go at taking it through regulatory approval, which for a product like this is quite a lengthy process, and then eventually to market. So all of our technology always evolves as it makes contact with the real world, right? And that's why that's in my job title, and it sounds funny, but it's very real. It's, you know, forces as diverse as like physics and biology, but also culture and economics have shaped our projects and radically changed their direction. So that means we do actually need to take them out as fast as possible, which is hard in hardware. Like I worked in software before. If the software doesn't work, you just kind of, you know, reload it and it's okay, especially with browser-based software. But at X, like, it can be very painful when you get the hardware wrong. So I'm going to tell you this story, which is Glass. It's a great example of why it's still worth taking the lessons. So Glass, in its first year, built a new prototype every like 4 to 6 weeks, which is a crazy fast iteration in hardware. And they went from this thing that looks like RoboCop on the left to the prototype on the right that is actually not that dissimilar from the one that they eventually went out with. And so in 2013, they took their prototype out of the lab. In their case, it was literally taking it out the building, because if anyone had been walking around with a computer on their face, the project would have leaked anyway. So they launched what they called the Explorer program. And they got an early version of the device into the hands of lots of different people. So chefs and oil engineers and doctors and parents and athletes and fashion models, etc. And they gave us a lot of feedback. The battery life sucked. The UI was voice, and voice was not that great in 2013, so talking to your glass could be a very painful experience. They also gave us feedback on the use cases, and it turned out that for consumers, things like this, taking a picture hands-free of your kid or a video, was kind of charming, but it ultimately was not compelling enough to want to wear a computer on your face. And as the backlash started and people were being thrown out of bars for videoing other people, supposedly, little did they know the battery would never have been able to support that, consumers didn't want to wear it anymore. But it was a completely different story in B2B. So quietly all over the place, even though that was not our target market, people started using it on factory floors and warehouses and doctors' offices. They got access to training videos, to instruction manuals, or in the case of the doctor, she's looking at her patient notes. So instead of looking at a computer in the corner and tapping away there, she can actually have a conversation with her patient. And it turns out if you're assembling a Boeing 747 where the manual is literally my height, being able to go to just the bit of the manual that you need is incredibly useful, and you don't care about battery life. So there's no way we could have predicted this from inside the lab. If we hadn't unleashed like glass and dealt with all the kind of feedback, even though it was sometimes tough, we would have never found out. So when you're working on these kind of projects, it's really important to think like, who's my user? Like, why would they want this? And then get them to try out a prototype and give you the feedback directly. Sometimes we also fall in love with the wrong problem. So when we first started Project Wing, our drone project, I have to admit we kind of started with the tech and then thought about like what's the problem we want to solve with drones, which we thought would be an important technology. And the first application was to deliver defibrillators to heart attack victims. And this was super inspiring, right? You can turn drones into life-saving machines. But then our user research team gave innocent bystanders a defibrillator and pointed at a dummy on the floor in the lab and said, save that person's life. And then they timed them. And it turns out it takes most people about 6 minutes to figure out how to use a defibrillator. And after 7 or 8 minutes, the ambulance shows up anyway. So it's kind of pointless to deliver the defibrillator by drone. The engineers were pretty devastated, I have to say. And when you look at that story, the engineers were very much thinking about the how do you solve this problem, how do you deliver a defibrillator using a drone, whereas the researchers asked a completely different question. They said, why would we do this in the first place? And based on their insight, the whole course of the project changed. So now we're delivering pharmacy items and food, which sounds like a joke. It's like, taco copter, but it's incredibly popular. And actually, there's a serious part to it, because if you can deliver food, a hot meal in 15 minutes, you can pretty much deliver any small parcel. So this kind of case study is a really good example of what we call cognitive diversity causing constructive friction, and where you get different people with different backgrounds kind of meshing together in these teams, which leads to a better outcome in the end. So that brings me to the final part of my talk. Alan Kay was a computer scientist at Xerox PARC who in the 70s invented like everything from the Windows UI to the mouse, etc. And he said the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I think it's a great quote, but we often think of like the lonely inventor, right? And that's a great myth. It's another great myth of the Valley, because the greatest inventions are never made by a single person. Even Edison had armies of people behind him. And the best ideas, I really think, come from great teams, not from great men. So technology needs to reflect the people who use it, and that means that the people who make it also have to be reflected in those teams, and you have to harness these diverse perspectives. So at X, our teams are by nature very multidisciplinary. So we have hardware engineers and software engineers and biologists who rub shoulders with product managers and designers, but also lawyers and policy people and business strategists and storytellers, etc. But what's also interesting is that our teams have really wide varieties of backgrounds. So lots of them join directly out of universities. We have lots of PhDs, right? But we also have many who have very non-linear career paths. So we have people who worked in fashion. Pam, the test engineer on Loon, she has no engineering degree at all. And she was a seamstress and a fashion designer. We have lots of army veterans who climb up onto mountains to like retrieve the balloons when we lost them. Now we lose fewer balloons, but in the early days we lost quite a few. Makers and artists. So I think it's a really common misconception that to be a technologist you have to be an engineer. I'm not an engineer. I did philosophy and psychology. And in the beginning, when I started managing engineers, I was very, very self-conscious about it. And then I discovered they love it because I can't do their job. so I have to manage them in a different way, which my method is I ask them lots of difficult questions, which I actually like much better. So I've worked in tech my entire career since 1999, and I would definitely describe myself as a technologist. So I actually argue that in order to solve the world's biggest problems, we need people from all fields. And there's no field that's hotter than anything else at the moment than artificial intelligence. And in no field is it more important that we don't just have computer scientists and engineers working on it. So this is a quote from Fei Li. She's a computer science professor, and she also has a neuroscience background. She's at Stanford. She's the director of the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab, and she's completely one of my heroes. She's amazing. And she's an advocate for human-centered AI, which she says means three things. So the first thing is we have to build AI technologies that are actually inspired by the versatility and the depth of the human experience. So that means we have to reconnect AI with fields like cognitive science and psychology, but also sociology and other areas. And part of the reason for that is not only is it going to make better AI, but it's also going to enable us to build AI technologies that enhance humans. So for instance, smart robots that help in elder care or do surgery, etc. So how the AI interacts with the humans is incredibly important here. And some jobs will be eliminated entirely. For instance, I really don't think that there will be drivers in the future, which is a problem because there's many communities where the driver is the sort of a well-paid job that, that provides money to the community. There's also dangerous jobs like mining where I don't really understand why humans should be doing those still. The world will actually be better off if they're not done by humans. But if you look at it, most jobs will just be changed. And the McKinsey Global Institute put out a really great report in 2017 on the future of jobs, where they broke down the tasks, where they looked at about 2,000 tasks, and then they looked at how many of those could be automated with today's technology, or technology that's kind of just around the corner. And they concluded that very few jobs would be entirely automatable, but that over 60% of jobs will have at least 30% of the activities in them automated. So that means we're going to be working alongside computers and AI for a long, long time. And finally, we should be guiding the development of AI at each step by the concerns for what effects they have on humans. So that includes the impact on jobs, but it also includes other things. So for instance, the bias against underrepresented minorities in data sets for machine learning. It also means we have to look at managing the tension between AI's voracious appetite for data and the privacy of the individual. Now, I think it's becoming very clear why to do this. We don't just need the engineers and the computer scientists, but we have to bring together all the disciplines, including social sciences and humanities. So I've talked about, how we use designers, for instance, to influence our design process right from the beginning. I've talked about, what I haven't talked about is like many of the other roles we have. So for instance, storytellers who think about how we talk about a project so that people are inspired by them rather than really scared by them. And we often bring in experts from the outside too, and that's not just technical ones, but for instance, ethicists who are running ethics workshops with our product managers, with our engineers, with our program managers, to teach them the basics of ethics and to get them to think about ethical decisions as we develop these technologies. So to conclude, we definitely live in modern times, like countless generations before us. People have always approached new technologies with this mix of pride and trepidation. From the printing press to automated looms to even electricity and the telephone. And so what we have before us now is really no different. But what's different is the pace of change. And that kind of relentless, much, much faster change in technology means people have less time to adapt to it. Now, I'm a technology optimist. I think there's many, many unsolved problems in the world where technology can play a role in solving them. This is the list that the UN made. We work on a few of them, like transportation, like climate change, like communications. And technology is not going to solve any of these by itself, right? And no doubt it will create some new problems as well. But I really think it's up to all of us, and by this I mean up to you, to figure out how can we harness technology as a force for good, and so that we can use it responsibly to make a better future for ourselves. And I hope that many of you will join us in this quest, not just at X, but look at tech companies more broadly, no matter what your background, no matter where you're from, and no matter what subject you're reading. So I'm going to close with this quote from one of my other favorite women, Eleanor Roosevelt, and she says, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." Thank you. And if you want to find out more, that's how you can get in touch with me.
Great. So I just want to begin by asking a bit about how you select the problems that you try and solve and the scope of those solutions. So obviously a lot of these ideas are about transforming the world, making it a better place, helping people get internet in remote areas, helping prevent accidents, with heart attacks or whatever. To what extent do you consider profit as one of your motives in the scope of those solutions? Where does that come into the decision-making process? Mm-hmm.
It's a great question. So all of our projects have to fulfill both purpose and profit, and it's actually in that order. So we will look at the impact first. So we look at the size of the impact. So if it's not going to affect a large number of people materially, then we probably wouldn't work on it. And then we look at the sort of the size of the impact, like how much better do we make people's lives. And the impact question is complicated because if you're working on robotics, there's lots of unintended side effects and other consequences as well, for instance. And then we also look at profit because we ultimately believe that problems like the ones on the UN list are not going to be solvable by philanthropic means alone. There's some great foundations, like the Gates Foundation is taking on a moonshot of solving malaria, but climate change is not going to be solved with philanthropic money. So unless we can find an economic incentive so it self-scales, unless we can build businesses around it, I don't think it's going to be solved. And that's why we have both of those. And then there's a very practical consideration too, is that in the beginning people thought we were just wasting shareholders' money, and we were like, no, we're actually serious about building like another really serious, meaningful business for Alphabet.
I want to ask about the inverse of your job. So your job was to get those moonshots ready for the real world, or ready to go as real companies, to be the next Google. How do you get the real world ready to receive these ideas? Like, what do you guys try and do to warm people up for the idea of a wearable computer in your glasses, or an AI contact lens, or a driverless car? Like, how do you make sure that consumers aren't scared but are actually excited to try your products?
Right. Well, we sometimes do a better job than other times, so I wouldn't say we always get this right at all. So there's multiple layers to this. So there's one which is how do you talk about the technology, and how do you design the technology so that it's less threatening? So the prototype I showed you of the Firefly, the one that Steve Mahon rode on in Austin, that it has a lot of safety features built in. It only goes 35 miles an hour. It has a soft bumper, it has a soft windshield, so if it did hit something, like people wouldn't get harmed by it. And that was very intentional because we didn't think the technology was good enough yet at the time. But then we also made it look deliberately cute. It looked, people compared it to a panda bear, etc. And we called it the Firefly. And we said it's a prototype. It's not the real thing yet. And then we worked with communities. First of all, we asked which communities wanted to test in their community, and there's actually cities are great test beds. They're great sandboxes for technology. And the reason that Waymo is now in Phoenix is because the mayor of Phoenix and the city of Phoenix said, yes, please come here and you can try it out in Phoenix. And then in the case of the Firefly, we also worked with local artists to design them. So there's a lot of things that you can do where you can be more sensitive to the needs of the local community. And that also involves working with regulators. So understanding how regulations might change. There were no regulations around self-driving cars when we started this because there were no self-driving cars. And it's not necessarily the technologists that solve all those problems. Insurance companies have to figure out how they assess risk, etc. So it's very much a sort of interactive process. And that's why when I talk about how the technology is shaped by society as well as society shaping as well as technology impacting society, I mean that. It's always a two-way street.
Final question I want to ask is about sort of gap between the UK and the US in terms of entrepreneurship and tech. We talked about before, you said you thought that gap was closing a lot. Do you think that the main imbalance is a cultural one, or is there actually a hard skills deficit in the UK?
I don't think it's a hard skills deficit. I think it's an experience gap. So Silicon Valley has second, third generation entrepreneurs, right? So people who have had an exit and who then invest in the next generation of entrepreneurs and build their next company as well. So we're just, in Europe, we're just behind because we haven't had, we're kind of missing a couple of decades of that. I personally think when I set up a startup, so I set up a company called etoys.com, which was an American startup coming into Europe in the late 90s. There was nothing. I mean, you were really very much on your own, and that's not the case anymore. Now, if you're in any of these hubs, whether it's London or Berlin or Estonia or Sweden, there's thriving startup hubs in many European cities. And I actually think that the Europeans are better set up to solve some of these problems. Transportation in the US is really weird, right? Where everyone just drives a car, for instance. Whereas people who live in European cities know what it's like to deal with a really small, densely populated area. So I think that a lot is changing. There's a lot more money here. What's still not quite there is the support for the later stage entrepreneurs. So I think if you're starting out for the first stage of the startup, it's great here, but there's a little bit less mentorship and a little bit less money at the later rounds.
Let's just take 2 questions from the audience. If you have a question, please put your hand up and wait for the microphone to come for you. Let's go to the hand in the middle over here on this side, please.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Saikat, and I'm from the MBA cohort from Oxford. And thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk, and thanks for the exciting features in your presentation. So one thing which I kind of observed in your presentation, that you're working on really amazing technologies out there, and one of them is related to energy also. We spoke a little bit about that, but not in full, Project Malta. Mm-hmm. And my question basically is from the point of view that most of these technologies are being developed in a particular point, at a particular point and particular location. But most of the time, the know-how transfer, the transfer of technology and the ideas are getting stuck at a particular point. So is it something that Google X has thought about? Is Google X, going to transfer the know-how also, willing to share it and integrate it with the upcoming tech startups and stuff, or how do you think about this?
Okay, so first of all, what I'm doing here, as far as I'm concerned, is know-how transfer, right? Because I'm sharing with you kind of some of the workings of the Moonshot Factory, which I think are actually much more important than any one particular project. Second, Lots of our projects are global, so they very few actually go to pilot in the United States. We go to wherever it makes the most sense. So Wing is now in Australia. Malta is very likely to start in Europe or in Asia. So China actually is massively investing in energy storage because in the northwest of China, they're curtailing up to 30% of wind production. So they brought in regulations where they said in some provinces where you can't build another power plant, like another wind or solar power plant, unless you also put in storage. And that's actually spurring a lot of storage innovation there. So these projects are not at all local, and they will go into many, many different directions in the world. And then finally, the know-how goes out with the company. So like Wing took all the drone know-how with it. Verily took the health know-how with it, etc. So the idea is, yes, the IP follows the project.
Okay. Thank you very much. And there is some kind of telepathy happened there because I was actually working on those array storage system, and that is the point I was going to make. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Yeah, let's go to the hand over here on this side. Yeah, there, perfect. Yes, you.
Hi. First of all, I guess thanks for the speech. It was great. I'm actually not a student. I work in tech, so it was really exciting to hear you speak. I noticed one of the themes of your speech was about sort of solving these big problems, and you talked about the benefit of doing that from a business perspective. But I'm curious if you see also any contradiction in solving sort of large systemic societal problems from sort of a multinational profitable corporation.
Tell me more about what do you mean?
Well, so for example, I know you've talked a lot about the job issue as well. So self-driving cars getting rid of a lot of drivers and how you work with the regulation around self-driving cars. But obviously, Google and X have a lot of money and a lot of influence in politics, especially to influence that regulation. So I'm just curious I mean, that's one example, but if you see any sort of contradiction in being the problem solvers while also having so much influence in how they're regulated and sort of who's supposed to be controlling the different profit things that Google has. I'm not sure if that's still clear.
I'm not sure if it's a question. I think you're making a statement.
I'm just curious if that's something that Google thinks about.
You think there is a conflict? But
I guess I'm just curious if that's something Google thinks about, if it's part of sort of your thought process when you're coming through projects and anything that you're working on.
Yeah, no, we think about it all the time. So first of all, I personally don't think there's a conflict between companies taking on these problems, because we can no longer expect governments to do it, right? Like that's how it worked in the 1950s when moonshots were done by government. I think today government funds a lot of basic research that many of our projects are based on. So, we're standing on the shoulders of giants of like decades of university research for most of these projects. But I don't think we can expect governments to fund taking them all the way through to commercialization. I think that's where companies realistically are coming in today. Now, I personally don't think that it's just big companies who can do these kind of projects. I think it's a mindset of innovation rather than anything else. But you're right in that in some places we are able to, for instance, negotiate with regulators in a different way, right? And I think drones is a really good example where in the United States, the regulator just said there can't be any commercial drone flight whatsoever, right? So we can then as a company say, okay, that means we're gonna go to Australia. Whereas if you're like a local startup in the US, that's harder for you to do, right? If you're sort of thinking like, can we then abuse like that power in order to like force the regulator to change the regulations, like you're way overestimating our ability. In fact, we did talk to the FAA in the United States for a long time about them changing the regulations, and it's happening, but it's happening at a glacial speed. So we went to Australia instead. So.
Great, thank you very much. That's unfortunately all we have time for. That's absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you all enjoyed that. So give another round of applause to Obi.